if you're going on too long. Or I'll go like this. I think we'll be okay. It's a long 30 seconds. Hi, my name is Lynn Hunsinger, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the first plenary session of the 74th annual meeting of the Society for Range Management, New Frontiers, in Boise, Idaho. And I've noticed today that Boise looks a lot like my home in California. But seriously, I really am grateful for this remote technology that allows so much of us to be here, so many of us to be here and hear so many of the amazing talks and events that's associated with this meeting. We can't be together in person, but it's a great way to hear what people have to say and to talk to people. So I'm really pleased that you're here to stay today. Our topic is inside and outside the ranch gate. How do we conserve ranches and support stewardship? And it's related to things that have been happening in the last couple decades of ranchers and conservationists working together to conserve ranch lands for the preservation of all kinds of environmental benefits and social benefits. I will start now with an introduction, but basically the way that this is going to happen is we have two panelists today. I'm going to give introduction to sort of set the stage, and then I'll also speak, and then we're counting on you to ask the questions that will make the question and answer period the wonderful event that it can be, and that will follow the two panelists today. Okay, I'm going to start my slides. I think we're all a little worried about the technology and whether we can make it work, but I think we will be able to. Okay, so as I mentioned, our theme is inside and outside the ranch gate. How do we conserve ranches and support stewardship in the West today? To help us with this, we have an insider of the gate and an outsider of the gate, although both do both, I suppose. Our first speaker will be Carter Cruz, the Director of Conservation and Science for the Turner Enterprises, or Turner Ranches, and Sasha Jeanette, the Director of North American Sustainable Grazing Land Strategy for the Nature Committee. And then there's me, Lynn Hunsinger, the moderator. So my goal is to set the stage just a little bit today, and I'm going to start, I don't know if these things are in the way, I'll put them over here. I'm going to start by talking about ecosystem services and social ecological services from rangelands. And these are basically the environmental benefits from ranchlands that drive us to conserve ranchlands, and for members of the conservation community to want very much to work with the ranching community, because ranchers are large, extensive areas of habitat and environment, often on better land than public land, for example. Great conservation benefits from them, but there's also social ecological benefits. So first, I point out two different aspects. One is land and ecosystem conservation, the benefits that come from the ecosystems on ranch lands, like watershed, scenic beauty, wildlife habitat. There's actually a million different benefits, spiritual values, it goes on. And then there's the other part, land and ecosystem stewardship. You don't find that valued enough in ecosystem valuations. That's the process of management. And land, if you're me, you believe it needs to be cared for. What with the changes in the climate, with invasive species, with our fire hazard, our ecosystems have been stewarded for thousands of years by Native Americans and then by ranchers, and they continue to need that stewardship in my opinion, to maintain the wildlife habitat and many of the ecosystem services that they provide. So ranchers themselves, it's important to remember, they appreciate the ecosystem services from ranches too. And in fact, they invest in them. And I'd like to say these are data. They're not everybody, they're averages. So keep that in mind, that there's a tremendous diversity in ranches and what they do. Maybe we'll get a little bit of a flavor for that today. Pope, 1985, pointed out that the average agricultural use value of Texas ranches was less than a quarter of the market value of the land. Torrell et al. Did a number of papers on these types of questions and pointed out that ranch location, the view, the desirable lifestyle influence ranch value more than production income does. And as early as 1972, Smith and Martin in Arizona wrote that ranchers are not profit maximizers. Ranches are consumption units, a lifestyle investment, a lifestyle choice. And in my own work in 2004, we surveyed ranchers in California, and we found that most of them, 86% of them, said that being in natural beauty, working in the natural environment, was a really important reason for them to own a ranch and work at ranching. And we also found over time, because we did this survey several times, that amenities and amenity values are becoming more and more of a factor for ranches of all sizes, including the largest sizes. Now, there have been attempts to value ecosystem services. I've worked on one. There's no way you can value them all, right? And as I've mentioned, social ecological services get kind of short shrift in these valuations. But just looking at the measurable values that there's data on, Van Butzik and Hunsinger found that from 307,000 acres of California rangeland trust easements on ranches, as much as $1.44 billion in ecosystem services annually were produced, or for every $167 invested in these easements, for every dollar invested in these easements, $167 is returned. That's incredible. The Trust for Public Land looked at 1.5 million Colorado acres of Colorado conservation easements and found that $5.5 to $13.7 billion in economic benefits were produced annually from ecosystem service values, or about $6 to $7 returned per dollar investment. That's a lot for an investment. Don't find that very often. The West Hill Foundation for Nature summarized all the literature on ecosystem values and found from rangelands and for grasslands and rangelands in general, and like all these things, this is a huge generalization, they found the values were close to $600 per acre per year. And yet, just doing a brief perusal the other day on the web, I found that ranches typically return less than $10 per acre from livestock production. Now, that is not all ranches. Like I said, it's just a common estimate. And ranch incomes, if we haven't made this point, I'll make it again, are small relative to their value. In a series of California studies that I did, in 1985, 27% of ranchers got most of their income from ranching. By 2004, that was down to 14%. Gettner and Tanaka, looking at permittees in the West, different group of ranchers from the previous, about half of Western public land ranchers depended on ranch income directly from the ranch, for no more than 20% of their disposable income, what they went home with. And land appreciation can be seen as an important return on the investment that ranchers are making in this land, but land has to be sold to get that capital out. And that doesn't strike me as a sustainable way to conserve ranches. So there's a question here. What's going to happen in the future, and what can we do about it? So, here's our big question, sorry. What can we do to make ranch production of ecosystem services sustainable for the long term? That's the question we're going to start out with here in our plenary question and answer session. So with that, I'm now going to turn this over to Carter Cruz, who's going to introduce himself, talk about the way he sees from the ranch perspective. Then Sasha will talk. We'll turn it over to Sasha to do her introduction and to talk about her view from the mega scale of the Nature Conservancy. And then we're going to open it up for your questions and answers. So please think about your questions and answers, put them in the question and answer box, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So now, Carter, I'm going to turn to you.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. I'll try to get my technology to work here. If nothing else, I have 150 slides, so we'll just look at those. So thank you, Lynn, for setting that up. It's certainly a distinct honor to be here today to present to you the story of Turner Enterprises. I work for a private land management company that's based in Bozeman, Montana, as the director of conservation and science. And one of the things that we are currently wrestling with is how do we try to understand and value some of these less traditional. Lynn, sorry to interrupt. Am I coming through okay?
You are coming through wonderfully.
Okay, thank you. So one of the questions our organization is currently wrestling with is how we better understand and how we value some of the kind of less traditional recognized services that private rangelands can produce for humanity. So I'm going to tell the story of Turner Enterprises, the evolution of essentially a missionless land enterprise, and how we have evolved into a ranching business, and now where we are kind of finding our footing as maybe a service provider, looking at some of these ecosystem services. So I'm going to give you a little bit of introduction and history real quick, and talk about our conservation programs, a little bit more about our ranching, and then wrap up the latter third of my talk with this concept of eco-agriculture, which is really, I think, providing us our vision towards the future. And before I go on, I know plenaries typically aren't multi-authored, but I do want to recognize Mark Kostler of Turner Enterprises, who's certainly a fantastic colleague and supervisor and instrumental in a lot of the ideas and concepts presented here. So real quick, we are a 16-unit operation spread out mostly across the western third of the United States. You can see we're kind of grouped in the northern Rocky Mountains and the southern Rocky Mountains, and then the central Great Plains. And our mission is to manage our lands in an economically sustainable and environmentally sensitive manner with a focus on native species and their habitats. So I'm going to run through just a few slides here while I discuss kind of us organizationally, so you can see the variation in our properties that are under our management. This is the Armendaris Ranch at the northern end of the Chihuahuan Desert in New Mexico. I think one of the strengths of our organization is the varied grassland ecosystems that we manage across, and gives us maybe a unique perspective on some of these ideas of ecosystem service values, or some of these other values other than just system-wide. There's about 1.85 million acres. This is the Vermejo Park Ranch in northern New Mexico. Bison are our management unit, our grazing unit that we use on our properties. We have about 45,000 head of bison system-wide, 11,000 breeding cows, and about 9,000 head of market animals per year. We have a big presence in the Sandhills in Nebraska. This is the McMurtry Ranch in Nebraska, one of 6 properties there. The Sandhills are a fantastic grassland ecosystem, one of, if not the most intact, large grassland systems left in the world. And it's renowned for its significant and easily accessible water resources. And finally, I'll end here with the Bad River Ranch, the mixed grass prairie of South Dakota, with a few comments on just our economic activity. We realize revenue, of course. We have some timber operations on a couple of the mountain ranches, oil and gas leases, mostly from third-party mineral right holders. We do have an active crop production currently on Turner properties. There's still a few thousand acres under active agriculture, but most of the cropland or the ag land that was present on these ranches when they were purchased has been planted back to grasslands. And it might be important context for some people. These ranches are operated as a business entity. They're self-sufficient. They are not, there's not a slush fund sitting off to the side that can pump money in when we have bad years, but they are managed to be profitable. So real quickly, I wanted to give this perspective of our history. We, of course, went into a really rapid growth phase with the purchase of the first property in 1987. And when I said in my introduction, we were kind of missionless, there really wasn't an objective or a goal for Mr. Turner when he started his purchase of land. He loved the outdoors. He loved the idea of conservation and large landscapes, and began to purchase ranches mostly from an aesthetic and kind of recreational perspective. But that quickly morphed into a ranching business focused on bison. He was enamored with bison and bison conservation, but for a period of about 15 to 20 years, there was just an enormous growth in the acreage under our management. And then we moved into what I call our build out phase, where we had to get just the basic infrastructure on those properties finished up. We had to get the right employees in place. We had to learn our systems and learn our animals and things like that. And then I'm going to spend some time in this talk on kind of what I call our efficiency and then the eco-agriculture phases, which is more of our present day and future. I do want to point out that conservation was an incredibly important part of our early stages. There were a couple groups formed, the Turner Endangered Species Fund and the Turner Biodiversity Divisions, that were wholly focused on imperiled and native species conservation and management as this rapid growth was going on the ranches. And those organizations formed very quickly, staffed up with biologists, and began to implement on-the-ground projects while the ranches themselves were still in this kind of build-out phase. So I'm going to go into those conservation programs a little bit to give you some perspective about how we've approached that, and how hopefully by the end of this talk you see how that fits into our vision of these services that our ranches will provide going forward. We essentially have 5 objectives for the conservation programs. The first one is obviously the most important, is why we were founded: to conserve and restore native, imperiled, and endangered species and their habitats. And you can't do that with a public resource on private lands without good long-term collaborative relationships with the state and federal agencies and other organizations that manage the public resources like fish and wildlife. So we worked incredibly hard to develop those relationships early on to allow us to implement some of the projects I'm going to talk about. We also wanted to conduct credible research alongside conservation. So that was an important part of our objectives. Work with and educate other private landowners who might be interested in this sort of work, and then of course develop and train young professionals. So this, just real quickly, is a list of species that we have worked with over the 25 or so years of the conservation program being in existence. The bold-faced ones are the ones that I would say we've had substantial long-term multi-year efforts involved. And I'm not going to go through these any more than to just show that there's been a substantial effort, significant effort to look at numerous imperiled and sensitive species on Turner properties. Here I'm gonna focus into 3. It just looked like my video had quit. I hope it hasn't. Examples of our conservation programs. Of course, front and center is the bison. The pressures that bison were facing were, of course, I think everybody knows, historically over harvest on the plains as they were settled, and current day probably more social pressures that prevent an animal of this size and the scale it needs to operate at from being restored as wild animals on the landscape. They do have to true of a lot of imperiled or native species, but to save them, you got to eat them. And that was the approach he took here. They are, as I pointed out earlier, an important economic driver for our organization. As we talk about it in a conservation context, however, as a native species on the plains, these are not wild animals. All the states we operate in view them as livestock when they're held privately. they're not free range. We have substantial properties in size and scale, but even there, bison, aren't able to migrate and wander over the scale that they would have historically. So we acknowledge those shortcomings in terms of bison from a conservation perspective, but we do, I think, provide some important components to bison conservation. We have large herds. Most of the ranches have thousands of animals on them, a few to up to 8,000 animals. They are operating over fairly large landscapes. 40 to the largest ranch in New Mexico is 560,000 acres. Populations of that size at that scale are an important genetic reservoir of the bison genome. It does preserve some of the social behavior at scale. We do minimal selection in selecting animals when we are managing the herds. I mentioned earlier the varied ecosystems that the bison, so the selection pressures are across a variety of ecosystems. And we do have two conservation valuable herds. They're called the Castle Rock and Yellowstone herds, which are, to the best of our knowledge, genetically pure. Most bison have a little bit of cattle genome in them. These two herds, which are operated on different ranches, are genetically pure. Had on Turner ranches is cutthroat trout restoration. They were the native trout salmonid to the Rocky Mountains. There is a coastal subspecies, but they primarily were found in the interior Rocky Mountains and declined. Several have been petitioned for listing. Some have been listing. There's 14 subspecies. They've declined primarily due to habitat loss, water diversions, things like that, as well as immense pressure from non-natives. They hybridize with rainbow trout and don't compete well with brook and brown trout, which are all non-native. We've restored cutthroat trout to about 250 miles of stream through 7 projects on 4 of our ranches, including 2 of the largest native fish restoration projects that have ever been conducted in the United States. And the primary focus there is you remove those non-native fish that the cutthroat can't compete well with. These had large conservation benefits for the species. In fact, the Rio Grande cutthroat trout was held off of the endangered species list because of a large collaborative project in New Mexico. And the point I want to make is, we can talk about size and scale, size properties and landowners, but even small landowners can have huge conservation benefits for a species like the cutthroat trout. These projects are done on. And I do want to point out that although we did not go into this with economic dollar signs in our mind in terms of what we do think as we develop our ecotourism businesses, that these may have a value to the ranch in the future if anglers want to come to our properties and be able to catch a fish that's rare or imperiled. And the last conservation project I want to talk about is the desert bighorn sheep. This was a project we did in our Armendaris Ranch in New Mexico. Desert bighorn sheep had declined and were listed as endangered in the state of New Mexico due to harvest, disease issues, and predation issues. This population was introduced on a mountain range that was wholly contained in the Armendaris Ranch in 1997, ultimately grew to be the largest population of desert bighorn sheep in New Mexico and was a big part of the reason the state was able to delist the species. And importantly for us, as part of our conservation programs, they've been able to move almost 80 individuals from this population to start populations elsewhere. Harvest is now allowed, and it's an important part of our ability to maintain this project and manage this project into the future. We have an access agreement or a licensing agreement with the state of New Mexico, whereby some tags go into the public draw, and then some hunting tags are provided to us, and we can charge an access fee for those. And those, it's a desired big game animal. Those can go for as much as $60,000. If to the right person. So I picked those 3 examples in part because they had a potential value to us. Isn't monetized readily or easily seen as being able to monetize it. Those were 3 that we think we already have monetized or think have the potential to have some value, economic value for us in the future. This is one of, I hope, an important slide in my presentation. If I can encourage, if there's any other private landowners or practitioners out there, I really want to encourage folks to think about how they can integrate conservation, imperiled species conservation on their properties. I think a lot, like we do, feel like we do things pretty well, but I challenge folks. I always think there's some things we can do better. We're always striving for that. Private lands are critically important for imperiled species. 74% of the land is privately owned in this country, at least the lower 48, and 2/3 of listed state or federally listed species are found on private lands. I'd encourage folks to park the politics. Collaborative working relationships with state and federal agencies have been incredibly helpful for us. They've returned huge dividends. Some great relationships with the folks that are tasked with managing these critters and our relationships with them to do good things on the ground. I think another important point for folks is the Endangered Species Act doesn't have to be your enemy. A lot of private landowners that I talk to, ranchers and things, really fear in the Endangered Species Act. We have not had that experience. Like I said, those good relationships can lead to good outcomes, and there's useful tools in the endangered that can protect a landowner in terms of your ability to continue to do your land management activities without that you're going to take an endangered species if you've helped with a restoration project. Find the funds. We've been successful in the 20 years I've been with Turner to raise almost $10 million from some of these programs that are listed here to help properties. Oftentimes there's economic and ecological benefit for other landowners if folks are nervous about some of these docking and we have. All right, so that was our conservation programs. I want to shift into a little bit of our ranching efficiencies and how that set us up for this concept of eco-agriculture. So I talked about that growth and build-out phase, and I think that build-out phase kind of was completed in around 2014, 2015, so not that long ago. We kind of got to a steady state and a steady operational state on our ranches, and then we had a change in our general manager, or the person that oversees the ranching operations. We really started to look at where we could be more efficient from a ranching perspective. And that included things like grazing, grazing planning being really consistent, strong on our grazing planning, obviously rest rotational grazing part of that, fencing, learning how we can fence and control bison, water development for management, our working facilities, low stress stockmanship, drought contingencies, all those things, learned how we could implement things better as we move towards the future. One real important thing for us was what do we do with market animals? Right now, the majority of those go into a feeding program. When we were in our infancy, most of our animals were fed in off-ranch facilities, and which were designed for cattle feeding. And we just had pretty poor luck in those facilities. Our death loss was as high as 7.5% at times. Product. So we couldn't treat for some of the chronic diseases that might break out in a feedlot, and our animals were nose to nose with cattle in the neighboring pen. So we put a lot of time and effort into understanding how we can feed bison better. We've learned some lessons in where we locate our feed facilities, the group size that should be in a pen, how to control disease. You'll notice in here there's a alleyway between all the pens, so there's no nose-to-nose contact from pen to pen. And the nutrition. We moved away from the total mixed rations that were used in the off-ranch feeding facilities to a free choice menu-driven ration for the bison in our feeding facilities. We've cut our death loss to less than 0.5%. We've had increases in our average daily gains. And in 2020, about 7,600 animals went through our feeding facilities to market. What I want to point out there, as I said earlier, we're marketing about 9,000 head of animals. So some of those animals are going into alternative market chains that I'm going to come back to here in a little bit. And the final thing I want to touch on here in terms of one of the things that was really emphasized for our efficiency was education. As we've hired new ranch managers, there's been an emphasis on their backgrounds and educations and the energy and the innovation they bring into the company. There's consistently ongoing continuing ed for our ranch managers, and it's really brought a higher level of intellect to our operation, and it's brought just a more of an academic approach to problem solving, which is going to be really important for us going forward. So with the last bit of my talk here, I want to move into and I just want to read this definition because I think it's important. It's integrated agriculture landscapes in which biodiversity conservation is an explicit objective of agriculture and rural development, and the latter are explicitly considered in shaping conservation strategies. It's concept, and sometimes these words are old concepts repackaged, but I thought long and hard about this concept of eco-agriculture, and while we might have thought we were doing this all along, I think when you really think about it, how hard it is to really think about all these things when you're planning. Just one simple example for us, I mentioned grazing planning. We don't have, we typically, that's been a ranch manager exercise, right? And we don't just sit down with them and ecological implications of a grazing plan. I think going forward, that's an exercise for us, and I'm going to touch on that a little bit more. But it's really thinking through how these things are connected and what action to take, which then ultimately drives these ecosystem services that we are providing, and those services are functions that sustain.
It looks like we lost Carter. I guess we'll give him a minute to come back and see. I hope oh, Carter, are you there? You're muted.
Yes, I'm here again.
Okay, can you start your slides again and I'll mute myself.
Okay.
These things are bound to happen. It is amazing that we can all be here, but we're also dependent on the airwaves.
So you cannot see my slides, Lynn?
You're not sharing right now. When you cut off, you went off sharing. So all you need to do is go back to share screen and put them back on. I hope.
Okay, I'll try this again.
There you go. It seems to be starting. Okay, you're on ranching,
Okay,
agriculture.
Did you lose me? Did you lose me at the beginning of that? Did you lose me at the beginning of that?
Yeah, I think you should just start with this slide because it was getting pretty rough too. So go ahead. It emphasizes, Carter, that you're out on the wide open range. So.
Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. So I'll restart here. I really I'm going to spend the last part of my talk here, and I'll go a little faster if I'm losing time, but to really focus on this idea and how as integrated conservation and agricultural landscapes in which biodiversity conservation is an explicit objective of agriculture and rural development, and the latter are explicitly considered in shaping conservation strategies. And it's really come home to us as something that we really need to look at, is how we can connect all facets of our operations and think about them from both the production, the ranching, the rural development, and the conservation side. And it leads into these ecosystem services that we are being, Lynn touched on those earlier, so I'll just move on through that. So really the important point is, what does this concept mean for us, for Turner Enterprises? You know, when we started, we were really, we looked at ourselves as kind of a land or a ranch business. And then as our objectives and mission kind of coalesced, we became a bison business. And then as we moved more into this efficiency stage with information and knowledge, it was clear that we should be focusing on grass as our business. And then more recently we've gone even to a lower level and believe we are really in the soil and water business. If we look at everything through those lenses, that lens, the grass, the bison, and all these services flow from there. So it's really for us about this idea of the coalescing of the ranching and agriculture and ecological goals. So some of the things are how we're looking at this is, we're moving from more of a single species look in our conservation programs to community approaches. How does our land and livestock management affect soil health and water? How then does that soil health and water affect native species and biodiversity or production impacts? How does it impact our production? And then does that native forage that's out there based on this soil and water, how does that impact providing in terms of meat quality? And then what does that mean for us in terms of economics? Providing, and then what are the economic incentives to provide those services? So just as a quick example on that, land bird communities, within communities as a whole in North America, we're looking at this in terms of bison as an ecosystem engineer. How can we use the habitat to cover these different needs for grassland birds communities? You've got the long-billed curlew there, really likes short grazed areas, disturbed areas, that's where they live. Versus a grouse, which is looking at a much higher level of cover. They'll cover on the land and all the species in between that need, either that bare ground or that high cover. So how do we use our bison to create that habitat but still meet our production goals? It's time and
Okay, looks like we lost Carter again. Carter, you're going to have to share your slides again. Carter, you're muted, so I can't hear you if you're saying anything.
Am I back again?
You are, but you need to share your slides again.
We back on, Lynn?
You're on, Carter.
Okay, thank you.
You never know.
So I'll restart. So again, focused on grassland bird communities, just an example of how we're looking at this is using our livestock bison as ecosystem engineers to create habitat for the various requirements of these different species, everything from highly disturbed areas to areas with lots of residual cover. And it's a way to challenge our own thinking on disturbance and rest in terms of our traditional grazing plans. We do use rest rotational grazing, but typically things are rested for no more than maybe 18 months would be our longest rest period. And I'm starting to have conversations with managers. How do we graze an area harder and maybe let that rest for 2, 3, 4 years even to try and rethink how we're looking at disturbance and resilience on the landscape. Patch burn grazing is another concept that's certainly making its way into our organization about how to create these heterogeneous habitats on the ground. And then this idea of, how are bison similar or different from cattle? I wouldn't sit here today and say a well-managed bison herd does much different ecologically than a well-managed cattle herd, but there are some certain things about bison that are different than cattle, and we want to look at and take advantage of maybe what those differences are. So here's just a quick example of how we've used disturbance on the landscape. This is in the Sandhills. There's a whole micro ecosystem that's adapted to these sand dune blowouts. which are rarer and rarer these days in the sandhills, which are more stable today probably than they ever have been. So we've actually are trying to use the bison to create what some would consider extreme disturbance on the landscape to look at how it impacts that sand dune ecosystem, especially those species that are into that early successional stage adaptation. Another idea is just diversity of our native grasslands. And the reason I went through that ranching efficiency slides was because 10 years ago we wouldn't have been able to do this with our bison. We didn't understand animal handling well enough. We didn't understand what the bison needed. We didn't understand fencing and how we could use fences effectively to control animals like this. But the whole idea again is to come back with using high intensity grazing, which isn't a new idea, but it is with bison. And try to better understand what are the impacts of this management style on non-native and invasive species, community diversity, and soil health as examples. So how do we move this into an ecosystem service market then? I want to just be upfront and acknowledge that we understand there's lots of progress that needs to continue, much research to do. We have dipped our toe into the list I have here in terms of ecosystem services. I talked some about native and imperiled species conservation. We are entering carbon markets with our timber program. We are not yet entering grassland carbon markets. We think that's a market that needs to mature a bit yet. Hunting and fishing, I mentioned. Eco and recreational tourism, premium for product raised in a certain way, pollination, water, soils, and wetlands. I'm just going to go through a few quick examples. Here's an example of conservation services that have a valuation. This is the lesser prairie chicken, which is found in the southern Great Plains, not to be confused with the greater prairie chicken, which is found in the northern plains. It's been faced with habitat loss and fragmentation. One of the big things that has fragmented lesser prairie chicken habitat has been the invasion of juniper and red cedar on the prairies, as well as, of course, agriculture modifications. This is a project we did at the Z-Bar Ranch. It was about 30,000 acres of habitat, and it included juniper removal, the use of fire, and grazing management to restore the prairie back to something that was more useful for the lesser prairie chicken. So this is just a Google Earth shot of a juniper treatment area that was then burned to remove the carcasses. And this is what it looked like from the prairie chicken's view on the ground. He's, of course, jumping for joy there. The punchline here is we signed up with a Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agency program that will pay us $4.5 million over a 10-year period to conduct this sort of work. So that begins to value this sort of conservation work on the ground. Another thing we are dabbling our toe into is the idea of eco or adventure tourism. We've had hunting and fishing programs for a while on our properties, but we are certainly now starting to look at more of the non-consumptive uses, and that in some areas there's a lot of interest in that. So it's something we're start to provide some economic incentive. And winding down to my last slide here, I think this again another important way that we're trying to capitalize on some of these services or the story that we have to tell and provide some value to those is, of course, consumers are much more aware today where their food is coming from, and that will continue to grow the consumer awareness. So they have some choices about where they want to get their in this case red meat products from, and so we are obviously providing a grain-fed finished product, as I've talked about, but certainly looking to expand into the grass-fed markets, and that's not a new market, obviously, grain versus grass-fed. But what we think maybe is new, or where we have some room to find some value in, is the story behind the production of that meat. Our conservation story, the on-range story with bison, the on-ranch story, and then of course you can get these certifications from American Grass-Fed Association, Savory, EOV, Audubon, that all look to provide a premium for animals and products that are produced in a certain way. And we think there's a lot of room to add the value to our products by tapping into this consumer choice of what products they want. And the other part of that is consumer well-being. and to tie this back to some of these grazing practices and changes that we're looking at, this eco-agriculture. Of course, consumers are looking for a healthier product, and there's some indications now as we look for how to provide a better product is can a more diverse diet lead to a better meat product, nutrient density in the meat, and this idea of micronutrients in the meat. And we're starting some research to look into how we can provide the best red meat product tied back to our grazing practices and our conservation practices. And Lynn, my last slide, just real quickly want to point out what our future is. The Turner family is really committed to trying to try and look at these less traditional valuations on the Turner ranches. And we are going to move into either one of two institutions, the Turner Conservation Trust or the Turner Institute for Eco-Agriculture, which will really be focused on trying to understand and research and look at some of these ecosystem services and how they can be captured into a ranching entity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carter. Don't forget to stop sharing. All right, and now without further ado, I want to change over to Sasha. We have a lot of questions coming in. If you put them into the question and answer, it'll be easier for me to keep track of them, but I am assiduously copying them, and I appreciate you guys for putting a pin in these questions. They're great questions. Sasha?
Thanks, Lynn. Thanks, Carter. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. I really appreciate being part of the panel, and I'm just really grateful to SRM for pulling this together. Virtual is not ideal, but it's great that we're still all trying to convene. So my first couple slides are going to focus on the values that I think we as rangeland management community and professionals see in these lands and natural communities. And I think that really builds on obviously what Carter was presenting. I'll briefly describe how the Nature Conservancy has approached rangeland conservation and strategy over the years, because it's really evolved a lot, again, a lot like at Turner. And then I'm gonna pivot to how I think the public is seeing beef production, rangelands, and how that differs a little bit from the way that we may see it, you know, those of us kind of in the range profession. And then the last part of my talk, I am going to try to go through the different kind of revenue streams and how ecosystem services and also corporate sustainability programs are evolving. And then how from the range community, how we can contribute and engage in some of those processes and markets and why we should. So next, there we go. So I think this slide to me just really encapsulates the way that I think a lot of us who participate in SRM see these lands. And you know, I've been coming to SRM for 15 or 20 years, and I feel like we are all in pretty clear agreement that working lands and communities are important for food, for fiber, they're provisioning water, the climate solutions piece of it, which is hugely important, increasingly important, but also, of course, all of the different nature values and protecting also, you know, biodiversity and wildlife, and also the way of life, right? So this is what, Lynn, you were referring to early on about just wanting to be on the land and be part of a natural landscape as part of your career. And there's a lot of data points out there, of course, that support this perspective on the value of grazing lands and ranching. What we have essentially on these working lands, which is about 40% total of all the land in the US, that's about the same globally, about 40% of land is either range or pasture. What we have is 93 million head of cattle, plus also bison and other livestock that turn forage into food for people while protecting soil carbon, stemming the tide of development, like we were referring to before, supporting wildlife, native plant communities, and supporting over 700,000, in this case, just beef operations. That doesn't include beyond the cattle production system, bison as well. These lands have tons of challenges that they're facing. Perhaps most obvious is the price of land outpacing the productive value of cattle operations. Lynn referred to that at the beginning of her talk. And also increasingly erratic forage yields and climatic events that are increasing over time. So what we're all looking to do, I think, is build more solutions that support good stewardship and protect these lands for all of these benefits that they provide for people and for nature. So this is just a map that shows the lands that TNC currently owns that are rangelands. Each of them is managed differently with a specific set of species goals and community engagement. And so there isn't an overarching program that manages each of these, but we do try very hard to coordinate among them and certainly also learn from what all of our stewardship teams are doing on the ground in order to continue to inform our strategies and engagement on policy and other opportunities. So I'm just going to walk through kind of the ways that the Nature Conservancy is involved in conservation in rangelands. It all really began as a land trust. People would pick up the phone and call us and say, I'm aware of this piece of land. Our community really values it. How can we protect it? That includes, over the last 20, 30 plus years, also a lot of conservation easements. And this map doesn't show conservation easements. But I would note that most of the land that we own and also the easements, well, actually, sorry, just mostly the land that we own do have grazing operations and really active rangeland management on them. And most of them have cattle leases. We do also have bison herds. There are about 13 separate herds across the Nature Conservancy. And that is also, and we're engaged with the wind caves and the genetic management, working with also Native American tribes to expand and start new herds, and also engaged in the Bison Management Association. So it's a money-making venture as well as a really important part of the conservation story on a lot of these lands. So I'll just real quick run through. We also have a really strong engagement on science on these lands, like similar to the way that Carter was describing. How do we manage towards these important biodiversity goals, water, and other important values that are clear problems and solutions that the community surrounding these lands is engaged in. Based on what we learn on these lands, we also often become really involved more on the policy side. So that's both at the state and federal level, includes engagement with public lands agencies, but also on things like Farm Bill, where you have funding that will flow to cost share programs, technical assistance, et cetera. Those are all really important ways that we can contribute to supporting rangelands and conservation. I think a lot of you have encountered TNC in our community-based conservation programs. A lot of that is just intersects with the land that we own, but it's an important part of how we learn from our neighbors and also share what we're learning on these lands. Very systematic kind of a planning approach is something that TNC is, I think, fairly well known for, maybe sometimes to a fault, but it's a really important, Carter referred to the idea of planning and goal orientation and how do we get someplace, and learning and adaptive management, both at that overall strategy level, but also on the ground in terms of, did something work, did it not work, and how do we do better over time. But all of these things seem to still be not quite enough for the pace and scale of conversion and threats to these landscapes. So we have increasingly worked on innovative finance and also really bringing a lot of energy into our work with companies on corporate engagement. So that's something that I can mention again in a little while. So again, this is the way I think we see things in both at the Nature Conservancy and kind of broadly in the SRM world is, we manage land to support all of these different values, and it's a positive feedback loop. And yet I think there is a huge contingent in the public that I would say increasingly does not see these lands and what we do in this way exactly. And part of that, I think, really stems from the way that we have communicated around science and the kind of information around kind of footprint of different kinds of agricultural products and production. So this graph is, this is the way that I think many members of the public now see beef production. It's what is the acreage that it takes up, which I think, as we all know, the acreage that it takes up, that's the working wildlands, that's the natural part of these these ecosystems. But it's not really seen that way, I think, in a lot of the way that this is communicated. Obviously, enteric methane that is emitted from ruminant digestion is also a serious issue that is increasingly a concern for the public. And there is quite a lot of action in that space around understanding the ways that the ways that greenhouse gases, especially methane, actually cycle in ecosystems. We won't get into that in this talk, but I would just point out that it's a super complex space that's evolving really quickly around, GHGs, emissions. How do you account for them? How do you set goals against them? And we can maybe get to it in the discussion if folks want to. And I'll just jump through this real quickly, but Carter touched on the grain finishing, grass finishing piece. I think a lot of folks in the, like a lot of the public now and consumers really see feedlots as a kind of this factory farming issue, and it's really not a part of the system that I think people see as part of this larger production cycle around, most of the time animals are on working wildlands, and then in the last few months of their lives they grain finish. There's another conundrum here which I think is really important related to climate, which is that grain finishing does, you get your animals to slaughter weight faster, and therefore they have a lifespan over the course of their, if you measure it on a per pound basis, generally a lower GHG emissions, just because that they don't live longer. The grass finished animals tend to live longer, and therefore they have more methane that they emit over the course of their lifespans. And that's a real conundrum. And I think it's also something that the conventional beef industry sees grain finishing as a real, because it's so efficient, sees it as a real benefit. And so I think this is something that is just an important, really important space for us to be aware of and lean into for solutions. So again, I think the public doesn't see always what we see. People see, I think, cattle as a problem. They see it as a path to destroying the planet. And I think increasingly a lot of focus, even from a number of environmental organizations and scientists, around eating less meat as a solution. And what I would like to also speak to, and Carter was describing as well, is leaning into the idea that we can support good stewardship through our choices and through our strategies. It's not just about eating less, it's about how do we protect these lands and do support good stewardship through the marketplace. So from here, this is just a scare slide, basically. So this is investment in new proteins. This is the alt protein space, and these are just some of the companies that are getting money to create alternative meats. Now, if this doesn't kind of make you nervous for how do we support rangelands, then I'm not sure what does. I think there's a really clear path forward, but I think, like Carter was saying, the story of how we raise animals, the story of how we manage lands and rangelands and the importance of them is increasingly important, because I think there's starting to be sort of less of an understanding about where food comes from and the importance of rangelands and stewardship for nature. So just I'm going to try to run through this really quickly, but different kinds of revenue and financial support. It's not just about carbon markets. Sales and revenue are obviously the biggest, and I'll go through each of these in a little bit more detail. There's also the sort of policy-enabled forms of revenue and financial support, and then directly in terms of working with banks and insurance, other parts of the financial services industry, to a whole suite of different options. So in terms of sales and revenue, and Carter actually captured a lot of this in his presentation as well. Even though many producers no longer make a majority of their income from beef sales, it's still a place where increased revenue is possible through management and markets. So price premiums, more stable contracts and contract terms, other kinds of preferential contract items. And on the certification piece, I just want to note that there is, for all kinds of certifications, there's a certain amount of MRV, the monitoring, reporting, and verification aspects of it, which can require a lot of time and energy. So I think as you enter into certification programs, it's really important to pencil out that investment. There's also some really great examples out there of aggregated markets. So producers who work together in a co-op approach to sell their product. And I think there's a lot of room still for more of that to happen. So I would really encourage the producers out there and those who you work with to consider how to maybe work together in a more cooperative way around sales and marketing. Enterprises, Carter spoke to this beautifully, of course, recreation, tourism, and the kind of access to nature kind of values. That's a huge, everything from hunting to weddings is part of the equation here. And then ecosystem markets, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a second. It's mostly about carbon, soil carbon, and water. And again, it requires a fairly high degree of MRV investment if you're really going to do a rigorous program. I think of policy-enabled forms of revenue and financial support as including conservation easements, including tax reductions. So when agricultural land is taxed differently, cost share programs through NRCS and others, more public insurance programs, and also even public lands permits. So this is a big space, and I think it's really important to recognize that the public support and recognition of the values of rangelands is crucial for these programs to continue. So understanding and quantifying what those values are keeps these programs alive, I think, in large part. Again, all these projects, not all, but a lot of them do involve a certain amount of monitoring and verification. So this is always going to be part of how do we communicate about, how do we monitor what we're doing so that we can get the value that we need to stewardship and land protection. Last piece here is different kinds of financial services. This is everything from loan terms to private insurance. And all of this, again, requires public recognition and also the sort of technologies and monitoring approaches and tools that will enable us to communicate as quickly as possible and as consistently as possible about the values of stewardship practices and outcomes. So this is just real quick. When you enter into an ecosystem services project or program, you typically have to go through this project cycle. So I only put this up as a note that it's important to kind of be really aware of this at the outset, so you know that your program is really going to pencil out and that the level of effort is worth it. Carbon tons per acre, price per ton has varied a lot over the last few years, between $10 and $30 per ton. And I think as the markets become more regulated and there's more legislation in place around this, those prices may go up and they may also stabilize. So existing markets. So this is the Climate Action Reserve has a grassland protocol. This is really to avoid conversion. Let me make sure I just get all these right here. So this is a verified standard, again, for avoided conversion, meaning that you can sell the value of your existing carbon stocks in the context of a land deal. So this can provide, for example, some funding for conservation easement. And the Nature Conservancy has been able to do this for several easements in Montana and Oregon, I think other places as well. Another form of market, and this isn't maybe exactly what we were thinking of when you hear ecosystem service market, but I think this is a really, really important one as well. This is more of a pay for practices approach. This is the example is the Healthy Soils program in California. And essentially what that does is it takes money from the cap and trade climate bill in California, the marketplace there, and takes the money that comes into that fund and reinvest it in land-based practices. So farmers and ranchers can get paid to do stewardship practices. It has a slightly lower amount of verification and reporting, but it has a little bit more of a similarity to more of a cost share type of an approach. There is also an emerging market called the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium that I think is super exciting for rangelands and farmlands. They're in the process of developing standards and mechanisms to pay for outcomes on agricultural land management. And hopefully we'll go live in the next year or so. They're right now in piloting the standards, developing standards, and then piloting the actual on the ground projects. So this is where you would identify a suite of practices and then actually measure the outcomes and sell those carbon credits or water credits, and hopefully also biodiversity credits, with the goal of ESMC being able to stack credits as well for different kinds of stewardship practices and outcomes. So this is a pretty exciting space, and I think one where climate legislation, if that comes, could speed things up significantly. I'm almost at the end of my talk, but I just wanted to mention too, because I think this is a really active space that we should be just aware of and hopefully engaged in, is around corporate sustainability commitments. And there are over 600 food and agricultural companies that have made quantitative commitments to climate and other aspects of sustainability in the last few years through a program called the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And then a number of other companies that are making commitments. And this is not just to reducing, electricity in their plants and buildings, but this is what's called Scope 3 targets. That's the indirect sources of GHG emissions and water use throughout the supply chain. So that includes purchased goods and services all the way up to, it would be all the way to, row crops and to the grazing phase of the beef supply chain here. And this is a really important potential space, I think, because cattle production, bison, and the grazing phase of the and livestock really is where a lot of the benefits could accrue. So again, I think super active space here, and one that we all want to keep track of from the range community. The big question right now, the big questions that are being worked out are really, how is this going to work? Who pays? Who benefits? What are the standards? And there's a tremendous amount of activity right now. You hear Nori and Truterra and Indigo Ag, and these are all companies that are really trying to create a viable set of standards and approaches. And again, I think just really being clear about what are the if you do choose to try to engage in these kinds of programs, what is the value? Does it pencil out for you? How confident are you in what you can achieve there? So I think it's really important for range professionals to stay engaged in this space so that the opportunities are realized for producers and for stewardship, and also to ensure that the verification programs are adequately robust and science-based without being so onerous that they will never pencil out. So I think that's a really important space potentially for SRM. So the three big things that I think are going to be important for folks from this community to stay involved in: transparency and data sharing. So can we help develop a way to communicate about what is happening on the land? How is it managed? What kinds of practices and what are the benefits? So this could be through certification programs or standard setting. I think good conservation plans, like Carter referred to and Jasmine was asking about, and that kind of adaptive management framework is really the foundation for all of this. It may even be valuable to have traceability programs developing. I think tends to be controversial, but I think given in a voluntary context with appropriate privacy in place, transparent traceability programs could be really transformative for a lot of aspects of ecosystem services markets. Again, being engaged in the developing of standards and the tools and verification protocols. There are a lot of tools out there that are fantastic, and I think more that are coming. It's everything from Comet Planner to the Rangeland Assessment Platform, Pasture Map, Maya. There are Corteva products. So there's both sort of public and private companies, or public tools and also private companies that are investing in this space. So that's a really exciting area. And then also this idea of kind of who pays and who benefits. I think a lot of this activity is happening right now in voluntary market settings. Increasingly, I think there will probably be more regulated markets. And so again, I just want to encourage the SRM community just to be keeping an eye out and be engaged whenever you can in these kinds of pilots and programs. So what if we don't? I think this is just a cautionary tale. This is the very last slide I have, but what happens if scientists and land managers aren't involved really deeply in setting these systems up? We were approached by a really progressive restaurateur a couple of years ago to launch a sustainability transparency project, which is fantastic. And of course, having a celebrity chef talk directly to a big audience of consumers is really appealing. And but in the end, the only piece of information that they wanted to present to consumers and customers was the percentage of soil carbon in the ground on the farms and ranches where they were purchasing their meat. And I think that was hard for us to say, hey, that's just not workable. But in the end, that is not nuanced enough. It's not enough to capture the many benefits of stewardship. It's not even necessarily related to current management. Soil carbon obviously changes slowly in many places. It can go down over time based on climate and drought, et cetera. So this is just my call to action to SRM community to really engage in describing the importance, increasingly, really actively to the public around the importance of these lands and good stewardship, and finding ways to build really solid quantitative tools, policies and programs, and just to stay engaged in the emerging markets. So that's all I had, and just look forward to some discussion with the audience.
Thank you, Sasha. You want to stop sharing?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, we've accumulated a number of questions, and Sasha, I'm going to turn the first one over to you. And of course, it's about methane, and we had discussed methane and carbon emissions earlier, and we've agreed that we are not the Earth's expert on this, and you may want to go to the climate session, the climate plenary session, to learn more about. I think one thing we can do, Sasha and everybody else, is complexify the issue, because there's a lot to be complex about in terms of methane as something that's been produced by all ruminants for millions of years. Yes, well, hundreds of thousands anyway. And also, I just want to point out that it's a foregut fermentation process that ruminants have evolved, where they can break down indigestible fiber by composting them in their foregut. And so the issue is belching, and I get very tired of the fart thing. All of us fart methane to some extent, but in terms of the problem, it's about ruminant burps. And so, Sasha, the question to you is about when they did that comparison with grain-fed beef and grass-fed beef, did they really take into account the fossil fuels that are used in the production of the grain and the transport of the grain and all the things associated with the farming allows us to produce these energy-rich feeds for livestock?
That is a good question.
About whether all of those things were taken. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I do think I think that it would be pretty important to look at those details. I don't do life cycle analysis in great detail, but my understanding is yes, that those boundaries were drawn to include those inputs. So if others have additional information or resources, I think we just really want to understand this as clearly as possible, so that the solutions are, we develop the solutions correctly and don't get tangled in which one's right and which one's not. I think the benefits of grass feeding are clear, and yet there's also this nutrition efficiency piece in feed yards that is also very real.
Thank you. Now, it's really good to look at all of these studies carefully, what they're measuring, what they're not measuring, and whether it's pounds per acre or amount per acre or amount per pound or all those different things. It's a worthwhile to really look at that. And Sasha, I'm going to ask you a question, and then I'll ask Carter the same question. And that is, you talked about how people see auction, the general public. There are obviously some people who feel differently, but that see the problems with livestock production. And when they are confronted with things like these methane emissions or carbon emissions charts, or land area used or water used, it's concerning to them. How can we change that narrative? Do you have thoughts about how we might change that narrative, especially since these things are all used by the alternative meat industry to support the alternative meat beans?
Yeah, I think that often when there is a direct connection from where you're, when you buy your meat or your food or whatever it is, if you can find a way to even find out where it has come from, that tells the story itself. I think we have very, very little transparency in the beef supply chain. I think you produce in the grazing phase, your animals, they go to the auction yard. Almost no information goes with them to the auction yard. And anything that did go probably doesn't end up in the feed yard. It doesn't carry on through the supply chain. It's just a very separated, each phase of production. So I do think that that carrying that information forward in and of itself could be super valuable. So that, how was it raised? Maybe it's through a certification program, or maybe it's through other kinds of documentation. But even being able to, I think, tell that story of, in your supply chains, to whether it's, at a grocery store or if you're buying direct, seems to make a huge difference. I think when people are able to access just where it's from and who raised it, and just a little bit of information about how it was raised.
And Carter, you're going to have to unmute yourself, but it seems to me that one of your goals is to transmit a better message, or a message to consumers about how your product is produced.
Yes, I would agree with that statement. I think, to the genesis of your question, I wonder if the story isn't connected or told regarding the importance of grazing animals and how rangeland ecosystems evolved under grazing pressure is part of the story that doesn't get to the consumer, and how those animals, whether it's a bison or a cow, are an integral, if well managed, are an integral part of that ecosystem that's providing these services that we all depend on. And I can't turn.
And I've certainly seen a lot of
No, you're fine. I just can't turn my video on. I don't know if that's important or not, but.
We can hear you very well.
Okay, good.
And it does conserve bandwidth to some extent. So let's move on a little bit to stewardship. Sasha, how do you encourage or support the actual stewardship or management of ranchers on conserved ranchlands? How do we support that? It's one thing to just set aside the land and say, oh, now it's permanently protected, but so much of the value is tied up in how it's managed. How does the Nature Conservancy work with that?
You mean on the easements and owned lands that we are?
Any ranches that you work with that you seek to see?
Yeah, it's a good question. It varies a lot depending, again, on kind of what the local issues and concerns are. On our conservation easements, there's always the easement will have some information about it, about how, if there are restrictions or on the way that land is managed. But in a more broad sense, obviously we work with our lessees on planning and goals and management issues. And then that whole suite of strategies that I described it's kind of the stacked way that we try to support producers and support stewardship through. If there's a policy hurdle, we can identify it and come up with a better enabling policy, whether it's Farm Bill or any of the kind of either legislative or policy approaches. We'll focus on that if it's going to be beneficial. So it's really a full range of approaches, and it could be even certification program and working with banks to develop better loan terms, that sort of thing. So it's kind of that full suite of strategies and tactics.
Carter, I have some basic management questions for you, and one of them is, do your cattle or do your bison graze right in the pastures with cutthroat trout? I presume the trout are in the water, but in pastures with cutthroat trout, do you graze bison, or how do you manage around the fish, or do you need to?
Oh, they are, they're grazing right in those systems where we've done the restoration. And that's, in general, that's a pretty important component for us in considering conservation projects and stuff. our mission has some inherent tension in it, economic productivity versus environmental conservation, but we embrace that. And, there are occasions where we set certain areas aside for conservation, but by and large, it's important for us to have those two working together and pick projects that will work together. So, but the direct answer to that question is no. Yep, the bison are right in there with the fish.
Lynn,
Okay.
I'm seeing a bunch of
And
questions. Oh,
if you'd like to pick one out, go right ahead.
well, I was seeing some follow-up on the GHGs issues, and so I wonder if it's worth taking a minute to kind of dig into that just a little bit more on
Sure.
methane in particular. So I think that over the last few decades, the way that climate change metrics have been used through both in kind of the IPCC world and also in the corporate engagement world has sort of lumped together all of the different kinds of greenhouse gases in ways that don't fully account for short and long term the different lifespans of those greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And in beef, that's really important because the primary greenhouse gas that's emitted is methane, which is a potent but short-lived pollutant. And it is also part of a biogenic methane cycle, so that as methane disappears, it goes back into the ground and it kind of goes through. So if the number of ruminants in the world is flat, then the amount of methane doesn't go up or down in any given year. And that means that the impact on climate is also flat. So if you grow the herd overall and grow the amount of methane that's coming out of the ruminant and livestock system, that actually has a really significant impact on near-term climate warming, on global warming. But if you're reducing the herd size or reducing the overall methane emissions through things like efficiency or different kinds of practices, you can quite quickly reduce the amount of methane and have a net cooling effect. So that's a climate neutral or beneficial outcome. And that's why this issue around grain feeding and grass feeding is important. And it's also really, I think, going to be important as we communicate about livestock, because it could come across saying like, oh, we just did the calculations wrong. Actually, cattle aren't a problem for climate. That could come across in a way that's really challenging, I think, for public communication, but is also very much the physics and the science around this, the atmospheric chemistry, is totally valid. So I think it's going to be important for us to engage in that conversation. And also the difference between what methane reduction can do and what soil carbon sequestration can do, because there are different kinds of practices and different kinds of long-term or different kinds of outcomes for climate. So I just wanted to throw that in there because somebody had put a link to Frank Mitloehner or some of his papers, and we can follow up with some summary documents about methane afterwards. Hopefully that's helpful.
And Sasha, to add to that just a little bit, when you're talking about the difference between the way methane behaves and carbon, the grain that is fed is grown with carbon-based fertilizers and transported by carbon-based fuels that emit carbon dioxide, which behaves differently from methane. So it's very complicated, and we continue to learn more about it. Don't underestimate that. Carter, what do you think the ranch of the future looks like 30 years from now? Are we going to see big ranches and little ranches and a mix, or are we going? How is the landscape of ranching going to change in your view? And you guys must be thinking about it because you're a long-term enterprise. What do you think it's going to look like in 30 years, and what's going to shape it the most?
Well, I'll just answer from my own perspective, not necessarily our company's perspective, but I certainly think, drought and climate are things that are at the forefront of our conversations in terms of, what we can do into the future. So if you ask me if I had to think about one driver that we really think about a lot, it's those. I hope things look similar in the future as they do today. I think there's a need for, everything from the small producer to the larger landscape. And but I do think there are going to be some challenges around, drought and climate, depending on what area folks are in. And, we have discussions about our southern ranches and their viability in terms of a ranching enterprise. They're certainly valuable from conservation perspective, and that shouldn't be overlooked either. But from a ranching perspective, so that's what I think drives our concern, and then of course markets and commodities and things like that I think every producer has to worry about.
And Sasha, would you address the same question from your perspective? What do you see the future ranching landscape looking like in 30 years? And a question has been asked about small ranches versus large ranches and all those things, and how they'll persist, or will they, and anything that you'd like to say in this area about the future.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I do think that this increasing the recognition of the value of these lands is going to be crucial to keeping them from even more rapid conversion and then the degradation that goes along with that. So I think that if we're successful in that effort, we can keep that full suite of large ranches, small ranches, staying operationally whole. I think bringing increased focus even more to different enterprises, different kinds of values, different kinds of markets will be important for many producers. So I am hopeful that in 30 years time there will be kind of our shared vision, SRM folks around maintaining and protecting and stewarding these lands, both for what they give us and also so that we can continue to have that kind of that cycle of that positive feedback loop of good stewardship and communities and both natural communities and human communities. So I feel pretty optimistic about it, but we have to stay on top of it.
It seems to me that a really critical part is going to be, as you mentioned, building those markets and ways for ecosystem services to be monitored the ranch owner, because right now they're just not getting as much return as they might from the ecosystem services that ranches produce. Here's a question, Carter, for you. We have 1 minute, and it is from a researcher with the USDA ARS, and they ask, future, what science and decision support would you like to see from the ARS in adapting grazing and bison ranching in the Northern Plains? And what knowledge needs are essential for you on your ranches in the Northern Plains?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm probably not the most equipped in our organization to answer that. But we've been in the bison business for almost 30 years now, but really haven't done a lot of, as I said in my talk, a big chunk of that was kind of the build out and the growth and build out phases, and we're just now getting back around to understanding what we don't know, especially about bison. We have some indications about how they use the landscape, perhaps different than other ungulates, but things like just basic nutrition needs of that animal, how they use the landscape, what are their grazing preferences in terms of what they use out there. A lot of our early forays into our management plans and things were based on the cattle model because we don't have any other information. So and that's worked fairly well, but we certainly found places where it appears not to apply very well. So I think there's huge areas to look at in terms of just how the animal uses the landscape, and then its physiology, its nutritional requirements. All those things are fairly are kind of unknown for that critter. So that's a pretty general answer to a question, but we certainly have range management folks that could engage at a deeper level than I can.
Tip, our time seems to be up. Should we continue for a few minutes, or do we have to go? Or Society for Range Management person? Hello? You're going to have to unmute if you're muted.
Sorry about that.
I wonder if
There
we
may
just
be
keep
some
going,
other
turn
events
this
at
off.
1:30, but sounds good. Shoot the next question.
Okay. All right, let's see. I had a question. Sasha and Carter, what is it? What are some of the things, and this relates to the ARS question, what are the things that would make it easier to work with federal and state agencies? Carter, we heard from you about this, but Sasha, you must work with federal and state agencies too. And where does the Nature Conservancy fit in with all this public land and federal and state agencies and their role? You mentioned provide markets that are good for the ranch community. Anything else?
You're asking about what kinds of tools would be helpful?
Yeah, how do you interact with federal and state agencies, and
Oh, yeah, but I mean, a
how does
variety
that
of,
work?
okay, yeah, a variety of ways. I mean, some of on our own lands will have, permits, actual grazing permits. But we also have a number of partnerships and projects that we do with a number of different agencies. So for example, we're just about to launch into a 5-state initiative in the central grasslands and the central plains with NRCS to really focus in on range stewardship and kind of jointly work towards outcomes. We have our Colorado chapter has worked really closely with the Land PKS team to develop wildlife modules and then do grazing management planning with Land PKS to really move to kind of move the needle on getting more people to have good plans and be able to monitor them and have the tools in place. So there's a whole variety of different ways on the land permits piece, for example. So we have those, so we have some sense of what some of the challenges are, and we've been able to work then in with other organizations, and then to engage directly on the BLM and now the U.S. Forest Service grazing permit regulation changes. So there's a sort of a smattering, but there's a variety of different ways that we stay engaged there.
Great. And Carter?
Yeah, we similar to Sasha, we have various ways that we are able to engage with state and federal agencies. We don't. I mean, I think people can be intimidated by that process, but we don't find it all that intimidating after you have a little experience into it. But to me, the biggest or the most important thing that a landowner can do to maybe find a way into the processes and make those relationships that ultimately bear some fruit is you have to engage and show interest in those programs, and partnerships will start to unfold. I think we typically reach out to the if we have a species or a system or something we're interested in working on, we'll reach out pretty quickly to the state or federal agency or entity that's involved in managing either a habitat or a system, and try to explore the programs. And in fact, you develop those relationships and show a willingness to do those things. I've been amazed at how often agencies have come to us and said, hey, we've got some initiative, or we've got some project we want to work on, or would you guys be interested in engaging with us? And to me, that's exciting in the sense that they recognize a capacity and an ability on the part of our organization. But I don't think that's unique to us. We have perhaps resources that some smaller organizations wouldn't have, but to me, it's about expressing an interest in engaging, and maybe even before that, moving past concerns and fears, regulatory concerns and fears that a lot of people have with permits and the Endangered Species Act and things like that. But federal and state agencies have process. It can get intimidating and it can get frustrating, but they'll work through it with you. And if I had some advice to those agencies, it would be to streamline some of those processes and make things a little less intimidating to private landowners, especially those that don't have a lot of resources to engage. But I find them very willing to engage.
Okay, that's great. Sasha, I understand that the Biden administration has a goal of conserving 30% of America's land area. And I'm wondering what that means. Do you have any idea what that means to conserve the land area? Are they thinking about conservation easements and working ranches as part of that scenario? Do we know what that means? Because I see all the time protected areas, there's a lot of different meanings for that.
That's a good question. Thanks, Lynn. And I don't think that it's all fully figured out at all at this point with the new administration. I would imagine there certainly would be a to some extent some designations, but I think this is a great place for SRM and ranchers to really get involved, because the kind of stewardship and these kinds of programs that we've been talking about this whole time are a much, I think for most landowners, a much more desirable path to thinking about land protection, right? To invest in stewardship, to invest in the people who've been managing these lands for decades or centuries or more. And so I think that that's a real opportunity to advocate for 30 by 30 to mean something that really is about stewardship and about the people who manage these lands now. So that's my hope, and certainly TNC will be involved in that process that is just in the process, just really starting, I think, to come together.
And Carter, for those considering starting to use the eco-agricultural approach in managing their ranches, both because they want to steward the land that way, but also market it, what kind of surprises did you run into, if any?
That's a great question. This is really us right now. We're just kind of changing our psyche in a way to embrace that term, I guess. I would say one surprise for me was, thinking that we had been doing a pretty good job of some of these things all along, and realizing that maybe we were falling short in several areas. So maybe that was the big benefit for our organization, is just thinking about it maybe in a bigger, more holistic perspective than I thought we were already doing. So, and I think it's also getting out of your comfort zone. For me, starting to understand, I'm an aquatic ecologist and a wildlife biologist, by training, and trying to move into some of these other areas of science. While there's lots of overlap, there's certainly lots of things to be learned. So that's important and challenging. And it's just it's a philosophical shift in some ways. But again, if I had to say one big surprise, it was maybe really sitting down and thinking through maybe my basic view that this really wasn't much of a shift for us, and realizing that indeed it is. And it's really, the folks, the biologists and things that work on the conservation programs would, not that we did that in a vacuum, but we certainly didn't involve the whole cross section of the society in Turner Enterprises. We didn't always involve a ranch manager in a discussion or things like that. And I think we need to do a much better job of having the multidisciplinary approach to looking at our, all aspects of our organization, and getting a little, and maybe that can be scaled up. That's true at all levels, to challenge ourselves to think a little differently in that regard.
Okay, I just have a couple more questions. Sasha, what do you think are the most, one of the consistent questions that people have been asking is, how do we turn all these ecosystem service hypothetical values into cash income? And what do you think are the most promising ecosystem services markets that we'll see playing a role in the next decade or so?
Well, I would imagine that at some point there will be either a tax and credit system, or some form of cap and trade. Like I'm not sure at all where that's going. That is not, you know, that is, I don't think, determined, but I would imagine that will occur. And that's a huge driver, obviously, for carbon. And on the water side too, I think what we've seen, for example, I mean, you've been probably tracking in California similarly, there's as water resources, including groundwater, are declining, there's more and more of a move to value them, and then to really look at land use and figure out how to you know, how to manage sustainably over time. Some of that is regulated, and I think this is, you know, when you think about the Endangered Species Act, and it can be really fantastic to get ahead of a listing, and do that in a collaborative way. And you know, I'm thinking about the candidate conservation agreements and the way that that's really been beneficial to producers to avoid listings. Maybe there are approaches like that with rangelands, and but yeah, I think that the question around kind of who pays and who benefits is still really being worked out.
And a last question for Carter. Carter, you guys have a lot of property, and there are a lot of small ranches around too. And you are doing wonderful things and taking all these creative approaches to management, and you have the resources to do that. What would you say to smaller ranchers looking for sustainability in the future and taking advantage of some of these markets?
That's a great question. First, I'd say that we have an advantage of scale, but I think a lot of the things, I hope it was at least somewhat clear that a lot of the things that we do are certainly can be scaled down or up, or to whatever size to fit. So that would be my first comment. And then I would point to and I think Sasha talked about it in her presentation a little bit, these ideas of, I think she was talking about co-ops in terms of marketing abilities, but even co-ops in terms of, conservation opportunities or those sorts of things. There's, as one example I can think of, there's a great organization in the Sandhills of Nebraska called the Sandhills Task Force. And that's not a unique organization, but it's a great example of how producers around the Sandhills have grouped together to maximize the ability to do certain projects and things there. So that would be another thing I would encourage folks to do, is find like-minded folks around you and try to come together. And again, make those relationships with those state and federal agencies. You'd be surprised what resources are available out there at big and small scale, and don't require a lot of, like for instance, cash input from a landowner, but maybe some work and equipment matching or something. But so I think there's lots of opportunities out there for small and large landowners.
Great. Well, anybody want to type in a last minute question? I imagine our speakers are getting tired at this point. But if you have a last burning question, type one in. Otherwise, we will move on.
Yeah, and Jenny just posted something about ranchers and food companies being really engaged with ESMC and the commodity groups as well. And that is absolutely right. And I should have mentioned that earlier. There's NCBA and a lot of the other groups are very engaged, which is fantastic.
Well, we even have ranches in the United States sharing land. It's pretty interesting what you can do when you group together. Very interesting. I think a good way to end would be to give you guys each a chance if you have anything else you want to say. So Sasha and then Carter.
Well, I think just mostly thank you for the chance to have the conversation and walk through what I see as some of the paths forward. I'm very grateful to SRM because it is a community of folks who really adds so much to science and management and decision making, and it's been a great home for me over my career with with so many folks who really are just amazing on the technical side and also as thought partners. And so just want to say thank you.
And Carter, any last words? Final words, I guess.
I echo that. Certainly thank you for the opportunity and reaching out to involve Turner Enterprises in this session. And hopefully there was at least a few nuggets in there. And I certainly want to put out there for anybody that if there's any intrigue by anything I said or want more information on anything, please feel free to get a hold of me or my colleagues at Turner Enterprises, and be happy to either answer questions or work together or find some collaboration.
Yes, there was a question about how to volunteer with Turner Enterprises. So you may find somebody taking you on that, Carter. I've so enjoyed working with both of you, and we've had an audience that's lasted a while here. I'm really grateful to everyone who participated today. So thank you very much.
Yeah,
Sure.
and ditto. Any partnerships or questions, please reach out.
Thank you.
Thank you.